welcome to another At History Gems. Now, the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem in the 19th century, while being a very holy Christian site, was actually ruled and run by the Ottoman Muslim Empire and had been for centuries. But by the 19th century, various external Christian empires, most notably in this case the Catholic French and the Orthodox Christian Russians, were beginning to try and push their luck with the Ottomans and impose external will on all these holy cities in the Middle East. The key point here was actually a silver star Christmas ornament in this church in Bethlehem. The French sent one in, which kind of said that they were in charge of all the places in the Middle East, all the holy places in the Middle East. And the Russians didn't really like that. So the Ottomans accepted it, then realised the Russians were getting angry, and then rejected it, and that annoyed the French. So this was all sort of turning into a massive diplomatic argument over a Christmas ornament. The Ottomans tried to keep everybody happy and ultimately kept nobody happy. And unbelievably, this was the trigger of the Crimean War. Crimea, of course, is a good 1,000 miles away from Palestine, but that's where most of the fighting happened. Indeed, at the time, it wasn't actually called the Crimean War. It was called the Russian War, because there was fighting also in the Caucasus and Baltic as well, largely with the navies in that area. But the French, the British, and in this case the Ottoman Empire united to try and push back Russian power, particularly in the Crimean Peninsula. The Crimean War lasted from 1853 to 1856, and it actually showed a number of developments in society. First off, it was the first war to be properly photographed, so bringing back images to the people back home. It was also the first one to use steam power, because the Crimean Peninsula had lots of coast, but the people were fighting inland, so the ships were arriving and those equipment and materials needed to be brought inland. It took years to come up with the idea of actually using a steam train, but as soon as they did, they were able to get materials, weapons, clothing to the right place at the right time, saving Allied lives. The battles, however, of the Crimean War weren't quite what people back home wanted. There were too many mistakes and errors, most notably the charge of the Light Brigade at the Battle of Balaclava. It wasn't quite the debacle it was made out to be at the time. However, what you also had was the very first war correspondent, and here he is, William Howard Russell. Russell recorded things as he saw it, making things more real for the people back home and realising how tough it was for the soldiers in the Crimean. Indeed, this was to lead to the most famous medal in British history, the Victoria Cross, the very first medal to be awarded to anybody of any rank for valour, for bravery above and beyond the call of duty. And indeed, every Victoria Cross created ever since has been taken from a single piece of metal, taken from a captured Russian cannon in the Crimean War. This does show that the creators of the Victoria Cross had one eye on the history books. A less noble, but far more practical invention of the Crimean War was, prior to this time, if you smoked tobacco, you smoked it in a clay pipe. However, clay pipes break, and Turkish soldiers worked out that they could use the paper cartridge firing paper to turn it into a cigarette. So cigarettes are from the Crimea. The next thing is the facial hair, the beards. Generally, to keep discipline or as a sign of discipline, soldiers were meant to fight clean-shaven, but to cut down on infections in the Crimea, they were told not to shave. But this was unusual. However, these were the first photos to come back home and affected people's views on what a man should look like. The look was so influential that in the US Civil War, you still have people, just 10 years later, with huge amounts of facial hair for actually not as good reasons as the Crimea. But that's why you have the US Civil War completely covered in hair. So the Crimean War not just changed technology and culture, but it actually changed the way we looked too. The Crimean War was actually the largest conflict that the Victorian army would ever fight. It's interesting to note, though, that by the end of it, the overall achievements, the overall goals, if you like, of holding back Russian imperialism worked, and for a time it brought breathing space to the ailing Ottoman Empire. But as I've already shown, there are lots of interesting spin-off benefits or changes to society that happened because of this war. And as for the Christmas ornament that triggered all this, you'll be pleased to hear it was actually found again and returned to the priests of the church in Bethlehem. So all those dead was worthwhile. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed that, as always, there are regular updates on @HistoryGems on Facebook, and indeed daily tweets as @HistoryGems on Twitter too. But don't forget, you can always get the book, The Busy Person's Guide to British History, available both as a book and ebook on Amazon. See you soon.